was already pretty late in the year. And so the Mayflower itself, I mean, even Bradford writes about this, like they were running out of beer because beer was very important. It was very important in the daily life. It was very important for safety because the beer wasn't just an intoxicant by any means. It was a way to have safe drinking water. Now, something that I originally thought back in the day was that this was tied to the alcohol percentage of the beer, the fact that it had alcohol. While alcohol is a great preservative, it was actually the action of the production of beer that made it safe to drink because it requires a boiling. So you're automatically, with the boiling, killing all the microorganisms that are within that beer. So that was the safety because the water would go bad pretty quickly on a boat on an ocean-going voyage. So they were getting there, and Mayflower itself actually had a history within being a sweet ship, one that had already was rather old, been transporting wine between England and well, from France to England, Canary Islands, and so forth. So it had kind of a nice smell to it, which I'm not so sure the Pilgrims were really psyched about. So already, beer was really tied, and this they learned this when Winthrop was doing the Arabella. So for the Puritans because unlike the Mayflower, not so well planned out for the amount of beer that they needed. With the Arabella, they actually brought in 1630 10,000 gallons of beer to this Massachusetts Bay. That's 400 people, 2-month journey, equivalent of about 4 pints per person per day. So they really did plan ahead. That's women, children, men, that's everybody gets 4 pints a day. By 1633, they were already bringing in malting and brewing equipment from England to start a local brewing production in these new American colonies. So, so already some of the first buildings were being produced. We got a nice little map here of colonial New England and a rather early tavern in Western Massachusetts, Weston. One of the first things that they were doing while they were brewing beer was also producing taverns, building taverns, trying to create a place for people to go, to imbibe, to also stay warm. These were centers of colonial town life, whether you're in Boston, whether you are in Springfield, Braintree, the tavern is essential because it's a place for people to gather. Even if you don't have a town center or, a town meeting house, you would be having a church and a tavern, two very, very key pieces to these colonial settlements. So with colonial Boston, the first licensed tavern comes about the same year that that first malt is brought in. So malt being the grain that will then be from beer, it'll be boiled and then fermented and becomes the beer. 1633, we have the very first tavern, Cole's Inn in Boston. And showing you how important these taverns were, that is 1 year after the very first church and 2 years before the very first school, Boston Latin. So by 1637, they're starting to already build out these commercial licenses. When you start seeing in Charlestown, you start seeing tavern licenses in Plymouth itself by 1638 to 40, all along the Cape, because licensing is also a key part of this because, the colonial authorities want to be able to tax what's going on, be able to make some money on this and control just how much people are imbibing. Now, colonial New England was really essential for all these immigrants coming initially for religious freedom, right? Whether they're pilgrims, Puritans, and so forth. They came for the religious reasons and made sure those churches were, the very first places that were being built. But the taverns were generally always the second, just like in Boston. And these were very important. These were public institutions. These are the places where town meetings would be held. The churches themselves generally were also without any fireplace. These are not warm places. I mean, I grew up in a town in Vermont that has the round church, which when you do like the carol singing in the wintertime in December, that place is cold. And so the churches, just to make sure that there wasn't any, fire to take it down, they want to make sure that there was a very safe place. And so there was no fireplace. People were trying to keep themselves warm with like, foot warmers and stuff like that. But the tavern would be right next door. Generally, it'd be like the second place, sometimes even attached to the church itself to make sure that as soon as the service is over, everyone could go to the tavern and enjoy some of that warmth, enjoy the conviviality of the libations, And this is where they would hold town elections. They would hold their town meetings. They would have like, the settlers would be like church, tavern, and meeting house. Meeting house would be secondary to all of that. Now, this is so important that even in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, fines were levied not for having a tavern, but for not having a tavern. In 1660, actually, Concord, Massachusetts was actually threatened with a fine because it did not have a tavern yet. It had already been founded in the 1630s, so without having a common house for entertainment, they were threatened. They did then put up a tavern, though, just to be, within the realms of the law. So it was very close, this relationship between these taverns and these early colonists who were there for religious purposes initially. Now, of course, the early colleges, the very first one being Harvard College, there again for religion, to train all of the priests, all of the ministers who would be there to spread across New England. So Harvard College in Cambridge had its own brewery. I mean, a lot of times people's tuition would be paid with malted grains, with barley, with beer itself. And we're talking, I mean, these initial students, all pretty much boys at the age of 16 or so. While they had a brewery on campus, there was actually a woman named Sister Bradish who had her own place near campus in Cambridge. And in a court case in 1654, there was a court case brought by the families of these students. Now, she sold bread, she sold penny beer to all these Harvard students. And the parents are complaining that the students are spending all of their money just on the penny beer, not on the bread, not on tuition and books, but in hanging out with Sister Bradish. Now, the Harvard president, Dunster, he didn't pick up on this. He was like, I don't really believe this. He told the parents, like, oh, yes, of course, we will limit them to 1 penny per visit, and that'll be it. But he actually encouraged Sister Bradish to continue because this actually saved Harvard a lot of money for the time because they didn't have to produce all of that beer on campus for the students. So things worked out pretty well on that end. But if we jump back to those taverns, the central place of the community is also a central place for the revolution. So I'm sure a number of you have maybe heard of the Green Dragon. This was a place that was built 1680, and in 1764 was purchased by members of the St. Andrew's Lodge for the Freemasons. It had 3 stories where you had, tavern on the first floor and second floor. You had a few beds maybe, but then on the top floor is where all the Freemasons would hang out. So these would be the who's who of the Boston community, the who's who of the American revolutionaries, of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, not the mob. We're talking about those leaders. So this is where they would plot, places where they would go prior to leading a nice little uprising that happened 250 years ago, this past December. If you're not following along with Rev 250, lots of events going on, by the way, all across New England, Boston, and it's actually going to be traveling all around the whole coast over the next couple of years. So the Sons of Liberty, December 16th, 1773, met in the Green Dragon Tavern before, getting themselves all ready and revved up at the night to go down to the Boston Harbor and dump 342 chests of tea that had been imported by the global connections of the British East India Company to Boston. Now, the fact that the British East India Company, that they were actually bringing this tea there was actually part of the revolution because like the Parliament and the king had all in England decided that, okay, the tea that's languishing in all of like these warehouses in London, they're like, we have to sell this because the East India Company, the EIC, couldn't sell enough of it in London. And so the king was like, all right, you got to go, hang out, go to the colonies, make sure you sell it in the colonies. We will make sure that they can't buy tea from any place else. So this is a revolutionary act, not just in terms of the tea, but it was against the crown itself because of that global tie to the empire. So after they dump all of this tea, alcohol is part of the revolution in so many ways. There's actually between about 1760 up to like 1815, per capita consumption in the whole like colonies and then the country was higher than it has ever been in the history of the United States and those colonies. People were enjoying themselves thoroughly. I mean, Jefferson himself having a pint of hard cider every morning with breakfast, sometimes two. So this had been really key to the foundation of, beginning of the American Revolution and the country. One of those taverns also played a very big part was the Bunch of Grapes. So public inn established in about 1680, but it was burnt down, rebuilt 1712. But this is the place where, after General George Washington received the army in Cambridge, he went down where he was feted and brought word that France would actually support the Patriots. Key turning moment. Though I do want to mention, even though Bunch of Grapes does have a very, nice little plaque there, important history. It also has a much darker side to history because this was also part of where the enslaved were bought and sold amongst all of the ship captains and potential owners around New England. So, Bunch of Grapes, there's never just one part of history, right? So, right here, part of the American Revolution that was quite key. This is actually a photo that I took from the Mass Historical Society. Kind of neat. They actually have a recipe and showing that for the Continental Congress with General Washington, what kind of quality of rations they got to make sure they also have their beer. So just like the Arabella would have 4 pints per person per day, all of those soldiers would also be guaranteed that they would have spruce beer or cider per man per day or 9 gallons of molasses. Because while we're talking about beer and brewing, molasses, after being diluted, add yeast, you get some distillation, you have rum. Very important part. Rum being tied to the British Empire as well, because all of that sugar is part of the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. So you have that triangle trade, looking at England, then paying for enslaved people in Africa, usually with alcohol, being brought to the sugar plantations, where they would then you bring all the molasses up to New England, whether you're in Rhode Island, you're in, Massachusetts, you have centers for rum production. So actually, Samuel Adams, you know, maltster, not brewer, was actually really advocating for beer consumption and production as making it the revolutionary drink, trying to stop the rum production, trying to stop the rum trade because it was tied to the British Empire. In order to get step away from that, he tried to advocate for beer as being the American drink. And it worked to some extent, trying to go along with different, pushing aside all of that imperial trade, making sure that it's a local trade. It's local consumption, local production. Keep the money and the ideas all focused on these American colonies. Now, there's a bit of a shift here because, well, there begins to be a whole new level of production, a new industry, really, that began here in Massachusetts. One that will be tied to a later beer trade. So Frederick Tudor, known as the Ice King, he's kind of basically originated the whole New England ice trade in terms of refrigeration. Because all of the beer that's being produced, it's all being produced at warmer temperatures. Like you don't have refrigeration unless, it's not like tonight where it's a bit cold. So he starts thinking, maybe I can sell ice, which sounds like almost as ridiculous as selling bottled water, right? But he's like, we've got lots of ice. There's lots of places that don't have ice. If I can figure out how to do this. So he looks at Fresh Pond, then looks towards Jamaica Pond, looks at all of these ponds of fresh, nice, good, clean water, and starts harvesting that ice. So here we have an image of Frederick Tudor himself. Fresh Pond, which you could see different lines of kind of ownership and direction. There were lots of railroad tracks set up around Fresh Pond to transport large blocks of ice. And he actually invents, to make this even better, in 1825, an ice cutter to make it more affordable, make it much easier and faster. And that ice houses, the number of ice rooms grow not just around Massachusetts, but he's transporting this ice to New Orleans. He's transporting this ice down to the Caribbean. He's transporting this ice to Madagascar. He even, by the mid 19th century, has quays like full wharfs devoted to his ice trade in Sydney, Australia. This becomes a whole nother industry, one that is tied to a very specific beer. So this beer is a lager. So those light golden lagers, like the Pilsner, for instance. Now here, I'm going to take you down a short little technological hole because there's a really big difference between these two types of beer. So ale, examples of porter, stout, India Pale Ale, amber ale, brown ale, all of these ales. Now, ale is pretty much the style of beer that humans have been producing for, well, we're looking at about 13,000-year history of humans intentionally fermenting grains to drink the liquid. So it's a very long history. Now, why is that? It's because of the type of ingredient that's being used, the type of yeast that's being used. So yeast, this beautiful little single-celled organism that ingests all of the sugar that comes from the grain and then releases carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol, which if you take a Sam Adams taproom tour, the fun in the beer, as I like to call it. So ale was what beer was in terms of the type of yeast. So ferments at a higher temperature, so you don't really need that temperature control, and also it'll be very quick. So like that fermentation will only be a couple days. So you'll be able to like brew the beer, it'll ferment, and you can sell it out the door within a week. Nice and fast. But towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, we start seeing lagering. We start seeing a new type of yeast that's being kind of incorporated into a new way of making beer, a way of making a beer that requires colder temperatures, that requires an aging process. So lager meaning to store in German. And so this was coming out of Central Europe, looking especially to Munich, to Spaten Brewing Company with Gabriel Sedlmayr Sr., basically taking his beers and then fermenting them at cold temperatures, around like 40, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and then aging them for up to 3 to 6 months in ice caves. So Bock beer being an example, Pilsner, Schwarzbiers, Helles, this is the type of beer that you will see with your Budweisers, with your Castle Lagers, with your Pabst, with your Schlitz, like all of these. And it becomes the most popular beer. Though you can read my book to check that one out. The image next to it is from Pilsen. So in Czech Republic today, part of the Austrian Empire in 1842 when it was first made, but being aged in ice caves. So ice, you needed that ice regardless of what time of year that you needed it. So Frederick Tudor's Ice King status was part of not just an artificial type of refrigeration, but also one tied to the lagering of this beer. So in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, this is when we're seeing this major shift. And all the immigrants to this East Coast of America, they're mostly English, sometimes Scottish, Irish, Scotch-Irish. You're not seeing as many people from the Central European countries. You're not seeing very many Germans. And so all of the brewing industries are pretty small scale, somewhat primitive, but basically what you're seeing, the modern beer industry, because of the East Coast location, Boston and Providence become kind of where the beer industry begins for this whole part of the world. It's most densely populated with immigrants, transitioning from kind of an agricultural to a mercantile and manufacturing type of industry. And you're seeing Irish, French Canadian, more immigrants coming in droves. And they're pretty thirsty. By the 1820s, you have several larger breweries. You've got the Bunker Hill Brewing Company, the original Boston Beer Company. You've got the Jones Brewing Company in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And if you look at kind of a map of the Boston Highlands, so it's showcasing it's a beautifully detailed map. This is from the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. an incredible just array of resources. So it's very detailed in terms of like the houses, the buildings, and it shows all of the major industries. So if you want to like lean into your computer, no, I'm just kidding. I have it highlighted for you. So beer has become basically the national drink. Much like Samuel Adams was saying many decades before, by the Civil War, beer really is becoming that national drink. So here we have some of the examples. So looking at like the Boston Highlands, who's helping produce this and who are the major, I mean, look at the size of these breweries. It's not, these are not little craft beer like pubs. These are major manufacturing centers for beer. And really, I mean, this increase of beer consumption grows throughout the whole end of the 19th century, where we'll see from 1865, we had about 3.5 gallons consumed per person. By 1915, it's 20 gallons per person. And a lot of them are drinking these lighter lager beers. So some of these brewing companies that are supporting both the map making and the industries. So we've got like the Highland Spring Brewery, we've got the Burkhart's Brewery, Vienna Brewery. So taking a nod towards those Austrian areas where the lager is coming from, where immigrants are coming, Austrian immigrants, German immigrants. And this is tied to German immigrants who were coming basically after 1840. So in 1840, there are revolutions across Europe. One of the most largest ones is in Germany. So during these revolutions, you start seeing an outmigration of Germans going not just to the United States, but I mean, they're going to South America. They are going to Africa. They are going to Australia. They're going to China, to Shanghai. They're going all over the world. And they're bringing, well, their skills, such as brewing these lager beers. So these German immigrants are especially arriving in Jamaica Plain, in Hyde Park, in Roslindale, and they are all producing these lagers. By the turn of the 20th century, we will see over 30 breweries in Boston because of the Muddy River, right? Right, the Stony Brook, which, I mean, Stony Brook stop, the Orange Line. What I love about riding the Orange Line along that part through JP, through Roxbury right there, is just all of the old brick buildings. Or you go down Washington Street, where you can see all of these old breweries that the buildings are still in existence. Basically, within 1 mile of Roxbury Crossing were 25 different breweries. So among them, you've got Highland Springs. So owned by this Reuter company, 1872 considered the largest producer in the entire country. First prize for ale at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. But you also had the Burton Brewery. So named after the Burton Brewing Company in Burton, England, where you think about Bass Ale, think about Allsop, Salt, different brewing companies that were very big at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century and continued on. Well, you've got a combination here of ales, but this will shift when you start seeing other brewing companies coming through. Breweries such as, this is around 1880, very large manufacturing companies. These aren't just small, like breweries for local consumption. These are for export around the country, a center of the entire country. It's not St. Louis, it's not Milwaukee, it's not New York City. It's the whole Boston area. So with the Boston Beer Company, founded in 1828 by Irish immigrants, by the way, things become even larger. Lager beer companies start coming through, and you start seeing more. I mean, there are more beer breweries per capita than New York, Chicago, St. Louis, all of them. And they're almost entirely shifting from Irish and English immigrants to German immigrants, some Austrians in there as well, all making those light golden lagers. They all tend to be family run, tend to be concentrated along the Storybrooke corridor, and running along different railroads all through from the 1830s onwards. So examples include Desher, lager beer brewer in East Boston, where you can see that, these weren't just areas. I love this picture because it brings in some of the details of what it takes to even have a brewery. it's not just about the beer. It's not just about the malted grains. It's not just about controlling the fermentation and the science behind that. It's about the coopers who are making all of the barrels. It is about all of the people who are taking care of the horses before you have mechanized automobiles. It's about making the wheels for those carts. It's about the transportation, the distribution. It's about all of the different levels that go into just what it takes to have a successful brewery. So the Munich Lager Brewery, so again, Munich going straight back, we can see also where we have multiple stories. Now, how these places are designed are they're supposed to be more technologically advanced. So the early ones, we don't need some of that like artificial refrigeration. You don't really need refrigeration at all with all those ale brewing companies because they're looking at a very fast turnover. But with that influx of all of these Central European immigrants, they're incorporating some of their knowledge of how to have an ice cave. I mean, if you go to Yuengling in Pennsylvania, you will be able to go to their old ice caves. Or like I did in Pilsen, you can go underground, have some samples down there, in basically building under the ground so it's easier to have cold air staying at a nice stable temperature. So those beers will be lagered for much longer. So with these, you would actually have a lot of ice towards the top and ice at the bottom. You would have the grains at the top being shifted around. Then you would have those grains going down into like an area for all of the boiling, then the fermenting, and then putting all of that beer into a cold area for fermentation. Now, one of the more famous immigrants that arrived, 1868, was Jacob Worth. Now, whose original, second location, recently closed just a few years ago. But he opened up a restaurant, on Stewart Street, moved it to Stewart Street, 1878, and was producing his own lagers. So he was also the Boston agent for Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company. So he was the one who was bringing in beers from outside the state, bringing in all of those Budweiser cases and huge barrels from St. Louis, and also bringing lagers in from New York City as well. So he was basically the first man in Boston to engage extensively in bottling beer for family use, where it wasn't just the brewery, it wasn't just going to, a bar, going to your tavern, but it was actually he incorporated an entire bottling system so then he could bottle the Budweiser and all the other beers that he was bringing in and then sell that to the local consuming public. So, I mean, he had arrived in from Prussia. I mean, his background was actually in wine growing, but quickly shifted to the needs of the location. It's not too much good wine being produced in New England. He was focused mostly on those German lagers. One of the more famous ones, which I also enjoy because the brewery itself is still in use today, after a bit of time between like the 1960s, the 1980s, where it wasn't, but the Halfenreffer Brewing Company. So Boylston's sparkling ale, one of the most famous, it survived from 1870 up to 1946 in Jamaica Plain. So you can see like the original nice little postcard right here showing the Halfenreffer Brewing Company. And down below, when it was still the Halfenreffer Brewing Company, lined up with trucks to deliver their beer all over the greater Boston area. Today, of course, it's the Samuel Adams Brewery Taproom. And they were known throughout. You even had the Halfenreffer like stack, which I'm very glad they actually fixed up all of the bricks that were, I think they knocked out after a lightning strike several years ago. But the Halfenreffer Brewing Complex is one of the reasons why Jim Koch decided to kind of settle in there, plus the cheap rent. So two major Boston area brewing companies tied to our sports teams was Burkhart's and Pfaff's. Now, the Burkhardt Brewing Company, established about 1850, was one of the very first German breweries. So, founded by Gottlieb Burkhardt, was brewing about 100,000 barrels a year. So one barrel being about like 36 gallons of beer. He had 4 ales and 4 lagers, trying to meet demand on both sides. And in 1912, he formed a partnership with our still long-standing baseball team, the Boston Red Sox, producing the Boston Red Sox beer and the Pennant Ale. On the other side, you got Pfaff's. So 1857 established by Henry and Jacob Pfaff, popular Bock beer, so a German lager style of beer, very darker color, higher alcohol content. They associated themselves with the Boston Braves. So it's both kind of a rivalry of sports teams, but also a rivalry between two separate brewers. So they associated with that. By 1916, this guy, Charles Pfaff, actually became the president of the Massachusetts Brewers Company and the whole director of the Boston Braves itself. So wasn't just involved for the advertising, but also in terms of the ownership too. Now, I'm sorry, but I have to get to a dark time. I have to move towards one of the sadder moments because, well, one of the things that was happening across New England, as well as across the country, was a move towards temperance. Now, temperance advocates, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, they were not advocating for prohibition. They were advocating for temperance. Now, one of the things they were advocating for was basically not drinking hard alcohol. So Carrie Nation, decent cocktail bar, but named after Carrie Nation, who would go around Kansas and the Midwest with a hatchet and destroy saloons. Well, they were advocating for people to drink lower alcohol beer. So there's actually a movement towards with a lot of these temperance organizations, not just in the United States, also in the Netherlands and other areas in England, where they were actually supporting the drinking of light golden lagers produced by German immigrants. So all across, because it was associated with a very different type of drinking. Because in saloons, it was basically typically like a male-dominated sphere where these guys are throwing back whiskey, throwing back rum, throwing back hard alcohol, and they're going for intoxication. On the other side of this, go visit Milwaukee, go visit St. Louis, go visit these German-dominated cities, you would find beer gardens, German beer gardens, where even after church, families would go, men, women, children, and they would run around and they would be drinking steins of this lower alcohol beer around 4.5% alcohol, instead of, upwards of 50% alcohol. So they were actually advocating for that temperance. But it didn't stop Maine and Vermont going dry by the middle of the 19th century. So while temperance was kind of wrapping itself within this, focusing on lower alcohol beer, they were focusing on that German style of beer. So when 1914 hits, and we have the beginning of World War I, where suddenly the enemy are the Germans, they're able to push through for a full prohibition of alcohol because of that tie to that German legacy to these beers. So as this political cartoon is just showing, looking at booze, looking at creating poverty and crime, Hun rule, focusing on that connection to the Germans with beer. They're not focused on those saloons at all anymore. Boston actually became a center for, it continued some of that rum production. As it had been doing for about 200 years, these are some of the rum runners that were captured by the Coast Guard. And this is rum runners in East Boston. Rum runner Mary right there, seized with over, $175,000 in liquor in Dorchester Bay and brought to the Boston waterfront. So Boston had continued its relationship with alcohol for the whole region, but not so much with the beer and brewing industry. Only 5 of those breweries around the Stony Brook area actually survived Prohibition. You had Croft, you had Haffenreffer, and you also had Narragansett. So Haffenreffer closed in 1964 and was bought up by the Narragansett Bay Brewing Company, which itself, Narragansett had actually been started by one of the Haffenreffers himself, who separated from Boston. In the 1920s, they actually bought the rights for Pickwick Ale from Lowell makers. And as you can see here, all of the different signs traveling around Boston in basically the post-World War II era. Very popular. But the thing is, it wasn't as popular as some of those beers that Jacob Wirth had been importing since the late 19th century, where, it wasn't just the Stony Brook area that lost a lot of breweries. It was the whole nation that lost a whole lot of breweries. The ones that were able to survive were the largest ones. So again, Narragansett being one of them, but Anheuser-Busch, Coors, Pabst, the largest ones are the ones that are able to survive. And they come to dominate the local market in a way that they had never been able to before, where you're seeing local parties, local celebrations, whether you're at a Red Sox game or you're being crowned the mayor of Huntington Avenue at Northeastern at the beer city limits in the 1980s. Actually, no, this one's from 1968. This is everything's wrapped up. You don't have a local beer scene at all. And so it wasn't until the 1980s where you start seeing a resurgence, not just in Boston, across the entire country. Starting in the 1970s, really with kind of like the rise of Anchor Brewing Company out of San Francisco and the establishment of the very first craft brewery in Northern California called New Albion Brewing Company. Seen Sierra Nevada Brewing Company starting out in Chico, early 1980s. But in Boston, we're going to see kind of a mix of the old and the new. We're going to see the Half and Redford Brewing Company. While gone, we're going to see that space now becoming the center for Jim Koch and the Boston Beer Company, producing what they eventually start calling the Samuel Adams beer, Samuel Adams brand, which, by the way, they're actually celebrating their 40th anniversary on Saturday, strangely enough. So Jim Koch, Samuel Adams becomes one of the big new breweries, not just in the United States, but the Great American Beer Festival going on in Colorado. Sam Adams wins many years in a row as being the best beer in the entire country. Granted, there's some controversy about that because he was also handing out free shirts and hats. It was all based about all the attendees and what they wanted for the best beer. So it could have been taste, definitely partly taste, but it could have been the free swag. We'll see. But you start seeing other breweries start coming through. Commonwealth Brewing Company, Harpoon, established in 1986, and Cambridge Brewing Company, 87. All of these being tied to this new growing establishment of Boston area as being tied to kind of an old and a new, and kind of a look towards those original beers that were brought over and produced by the colonists in early colonial America. They're all going back towards those ales, going back to those pale ales, amber ales. Aside from Samuel Adams producing an amber lager, all of these other breweries are producing India Pale Ales. The first East Coast IPA being the Harpoon IPA, 1994. So what we've seen going towards the future, we're not seeing those large manufacturers like we did in the 19th century, but we are seeing a resurgence of lots of local brewers. So whether you're in Malden with Idle Hands, Cambridge with Lamplighter, Trillium, all over the place, but just around JP, Roxbury, Dorchester, we've got Distraction, we've got Drawdown that just opened about a month ago, Dorchester Brewing Company, Roundhead Brewing Company. So in some ways, we've been brought back to the Stony Brook area and to Boston as a whole as becoming another center for beer and brewing. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Awesome presentation. I hope everyone else found it as engaging as I did. Yeah, I see someone doing the hands emoticon. I agree with that. Round of applause.
Great job, Malcolm.
Thank you.
I do want to take a second just to introduce Malcolm quickly, since I didn't get to do that at the beginning. So Dr. Purinton is a food and world historian whose work focuses primarily on the socio-cultural relationships of empire, trade, and technology in the history of beer and brewing. His first book, Globalization in a Glass, The Rise of Pilsner Beer Through Technology, Taste, and Empire, examines the development and spread of this light golden lager beer and how it became the only truly global style of beer. He's also the author of a chapter on the history of European beer in 19th century South Africa, in Alcohol Flows Across Cultures, Drinking Cultures in Transnational and Comparative Perspective, and has a regular column on the Boston beer scene with the Northeast beer periodical, Yankee Brew News. All right, and with that, I do want to open us up for questions. We have about 10 minutes or so. So if anyone has a question they'd like to ask Malcolm, feel free to jump in or type it in the chat.
Malcolm, I'll ask a question. This is Michael. I I'm going to go back to the very beginning because I've always understood, and it may have been romanticized a little bit, but when the Pilgrims first came, I was always kind of understanding that when they ran out of beer, they were using anything they could get their hands on to make beer. Is there a history of that? I mean, I've read like pine needles and pumpkin or wherever else they can get their hands on.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So the use of corn in beer doesn't become a thing until the late 19th century because it requires a whole new process. But as soon as they arrived, they were they would use acorns. The original pumpkin beers would be literally with pumpkin. Cambridge Brewing Company actually does a pumpkin beer fest in the fall, using lots of different types of gourds to make the beer. But they were basically anything that had some type of fermentable sugar they were trying to produce beer with. But I mean, 1620 to 1630, though that's around that's the 10 years where they're trying to do really fermenting anything they possibly could. Because when the Arabella arrives with all of those people, all of the beer, they're already importing malted grains, they're importing hops, importing specialized brewing equipment. And New England actually becomes like a center for the production of those materials. So upstate New York becomes huge for growing barley. Think about Cooperstown area. Cooperstown, so looking at the Baseball Hall of Fame, which was founded in the 1920s during Prohibition because trying to find a way to bring more people back to the area because barley was suddenly not making enough money, hops weren't making enough money, but Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, Center for Hop Production, enough so they could actually export hops as well as malted grains to Europe and other places around the country. So, but those very early colonists, anything they could. Acorns, spices, spruce tips. You actually find spruce tip beer being made by some craft brewers today too. You know, anything to add a little bit of bitterness from the sugar water that beer would be otherwise.
I have a question. So when you read a lot of the standard histories of beer, they say beer wasn't really successful in New England early on because it was difficult to grow barley in these conditions. But that, you know, you're sort of countering with a different history. And I know from my town where I live that very early on there are records of malting, families doing malting and having malting barns on site. So I wonder, you know, and counter to that, there's the story that it was really cider in New England that was popular. But of course, you can't start producing cider until you have mature apple trees, right? Apple and pear trees. So how do we reconcile those two standard histories?
So a big piece of that is the fact that it's part of the British Empire and not nearly as far away as India or Australia. So all of the ships that were coming and going as the colonies were being established, a lot of them were bringing malted grains over to the colonies. So it was all about an import-oriented production. So while you could brew the beer here, bringing just like the raw materials in made it possible to produce the beer and give it a longer shelf life once it was produced here. So having those nice dry malted grains, all the hops coming in. But cider was huge. I mean, think about Johnny Appleseed. I mean, they're apple a day keeps the doctor away. Yeah, that's kind of like more of a prohibition type of thing to try and save some of those apple producers and those orchards because they cut down like hundreds, if not thousands of acres of orchards during Prohibition because John Appleseed wasn't out there for the better health of the families. The seeds that he was sending along were all those smaller bitter apples that would be used for producing hard cider. So cider was much easier because those trees were hardier and able to grow faster and a longer growing season. But once they were able to establish, you know, more cleared land and stronger agricultural community, you're able to see stronger local beer production. But the beer was still able to survive the whole, like you had English porters coming in. You already had like full beers coming in for sale into the colonies as well.
Yeah, I have a question on beer Okay, a couple thoughts on, I'm from California. Okay. Pasteurization. I remember there was this cult around Coors that, they had to use, it couldn't be stored at room temperature. When did it start? What's it doing now? Should we care from a point of view of either public health or taste or
So pasteurization. So we're looking at Louis Pasteur. His first book on yeast is called L'étude sur bière, 1876. Basically, that's studies on beer. He was looking at, while he was tied to the wine industry as well, he chose to do beer fermentation as his first focus on fermentation and developing what would become, pasteurization. So with pasteurization, it's fantastic for shelf life. You're not going to lose any of that flavor. Like the technological levels today in terms of flavor and the multitude of different types of ingredients, in terms of different types of hops, hop extract, different ways of fermenting, different forms of yeast they're developing, ongoing. You don't need to worry about it. Most beers are going to be pasteurized by law because it will be kind of like a next step to make sure that the beer is going to be safe for consumption when it's already been in the bottle.
Thank
I see a hand from Franklin.
So it seemed like the dominance of Anheuser-Busch happens when bottling happens, because he's developed a bottling system, and otherwise it was barrels of beer that were shipped to taverns and bars. But of course, wouldn't there have to be some sort of local refrigeration? This is before refrigerators for the bottling of beers. For people to buy bottled beer.
So the dominance of Anheuser-Busch comes along in the late 19th century. So we already have artificial refrigeration with the dominance of the Ice King, Frederick Tudor, by 1820s. So coming from the Boston area. Anheuser-Busch, so basically they come up with this beer, Budweiser, around 1870s, late 1870s. And they bought up a refrigerated rail car line from Chicago that they start sending out from St. Louis, where they're sending Budweiser to Boston, to New York, to Mexico City, all across the entire country. Around that time that Jacob Wirth is starting to import those kegs of beer and then bottle them himself. So this is kind of standard practice for a lot of the larger breweries in the world. Guinness actually being very notable on this as well, where they would, unlike Budweiser, they would have to sell under the name Budweiser and Anheuser-Busch. Guinness would sell their Guinness beer, their stouts, to bottlers who would sell under their own names across the entire world. But Anheuser-Busch being more brand focused, focus on making sure that Jacob Wirth would be selling under Budweiser, under the brand name itself. But they did have artificial refrigeration. Basically, you have even without ice caves and just the shipping of ice, you have different ammonia-based refrigeration systems already being used for brewing, for lagering, and for transport of meat and other goods by the 1880s. So by the end of the 19th century, we are fully in artificial refrigeration. We're in better bottling because the crown cork, instead of using, actual corks. So the crown cork, which we think of right now, is just your cap on a beer. That gets developed in the late 1890s as well, enhancing the distribution, as well as kind of the seal for the beers to have a longer shelf life.
So I was thinking about in individual homes that I guess that people already have ice boxes, right? And they're using those to store the beer.
Oh yeah, and bottling, the idea of bringing a bottle back was very novel for when Jacob Wirth was doing it. If you've been to a craft brewery and you get a growler, it's like a half gallon of beer. That's named after the pails of beer. Basically, the kids would run to the local bar and have them fill up a metal pail with beer that they would put a lid onto and then run it back. But it's carbonated, so it'll make a growl sound. And so beer was going to be consumed the same way as, well, kind of bread would be. You know, it would be a daily activity of basically consumption, production, sale. So you'd be going out and getting, you know, your loaves of bread, your milk, as well as getting your beer is kind of like a daily, I wouldn't say ration, but a daily process.
And do you explain the dominance of Pilsners as being in part because it's these German immigrant brewers, but also because it fits somehow in temperance? It's not like these beers have lower alcohol content than ales, is it?
Actually, it is. A lot of the ales being produced were 5 to 8%. Actually, one of the ales I was talking about that was like 15% actually in the late 19th century.
Hmm.
So while ales, the lagering, like they were always focused on the lower alcohol. So one of my chapters actually focuses on just like the German beer migrations. So whether that's to Chile, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Australia, Japan, all over the place, tied to those immigrations. But the beer itself was much lower. But it also was a very um, standardized flavor. So if you look at colonial like newspaper records, you'll see brand names for ale companies like Bass and other British ones, but you'll just see bottom fermented beer or just lager beer without any distinction of even a nation, let alone like a specific brewery. So the recognition that any type of lager or bottom fermented beer was going to be a light golden lager of the Pilsner variety was something you'll see across the world with various newspapers and advertisements.
Huh.
Rachel, do we have time for another question?
We can do one more question.
Okay, can I take it? Does anybody else want to?
I think Michael had a question, so we'll do two
Okay.
more questions.
No. Go, Susie. Go. I asked a question. I'm perfectly fine. So you go right
Oh,
ahead.
well, this is number 2 for me. So, so my question was, is there, you know, when you're looking at this history, is there kind of a class component to the consumption of it? Is it primarily urban dwellers and working class people who are drinking beer, or does everybody drink beer throughout this history?
You'll see class and gender get played through a lot. You'll see how typically, I mean, even under if we're looking at like the Revolutionary era, and those who are tied to like the British Empire, like more directly, you'll see a lot of them drinking Madeira wine. So wine seen as more of a class like level, but wine production is looking at like kind of like a regional specificity. You'll see the beer being something that's shared across class, at least in like on the Eastern Coast at this point in time, because of the affordability, excuse me, because of its affordability, as well as major manufacturers. I mean, these aren't just brewers; these are owners of the Boston Braves. These are people who are of a high level of class just in Boston itself. Something you'll also see like in like British history in England too, where like they're up there with the bankers. You know, they're companies because of the amount of wealth they bring in. They are part of like that Brahmin class that you'll see, which allows for more consumption as well. I mean, got John Hancock, I think he was he threw a party once and served beer, and people were like, "Oh, dude, come on, I want some of that wine." And he's like, "No, we're doing the beer thing. We're doing the beer thing." But like, as you know, America gets a little bit more, gets closer with the French, you're able to have more of that import, but only for a few years before the revolution breaks out. So, beer was easier to have, easier to produce. Local production is going to be like you asked about before, the ciders as well as beer production. Wine would be able to be purchased by the very, very highest levels of class of the wealthy, but no one else could even touch it. Not like a middle class at all. But you also see this as something that is part of the home consumption. I mean, you would be initially at this point in time, before you get to more modern brewing technology, which doesn't really arrive in the United States until like 1820s, you'll see beer as part of, you know, being something that's safer than water. So if you're making beer, you'd be taking those grains and making one beer. And then that would be like a higher alcohol because it has more sugar. Then you use those grains again and make something that was several percentages lower.
Hmm.
They'd have a third running of through those grains, almost no sugar, an alcohol percentage of around like maybe 1%. And that'd be your table beer, which should be like your breakfast beer, the beer for the kids.
Like ciderkin, the lower alcohol cider for children. Yeah.
Mhm. And without the pasteurization, everything's going to go bad relatively quickly. We're looking at a shelf life of about a week. I mean, the hops will help, higher alcohol like percentages will help, but with that, before you have pasteurization, shelf life is quite low.
All right, Michael, not to put you on the spot, but you get the last question. So I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay, well, you don't have to drag it out, Malcolm. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But living in the Boston area, it seems that the craft breweries are kind of everywhere. But in reality, these bigger like Coors and Miller and Budweiser and these big brewery companies, which I'm guessing are kind of the living ancestors of maybe these bigger breweries that you were referencing earlier in Boston. I mean, what percentage of the market does the craft brewery really have? And does it seem skewed to us because we're living in the midst of them, right, as opposed to across the rest of the country?
Right now, the market is going towards, if you're starting a brewery, you're not going to be regional even. You're looking at your local consumption. You're producing your local because there's no way you're going to expand that much. So, I mean, even right now, you have the consolidation. I mean, Anheuser-Busch is owned by, it's Anheuser-Busch InBev, based out of Belgium, which is a combination of like Brazilian, Belgian, and American interests. That's also SAB, South African Breweries, which is part of Altem multinational. So it's one big company producing like one out of every 4 beers in the entire world. So lots of cities can say that they are seem to be immersed in beer. But we've recently seen several breweries that have closed already just in our space in the past few years. Somerville Brewing Company, Bone Up Brewing Company, like a number. And some out of choice, some out of, not because they weren't producing good beer, but because of other outside reasons. And so those big companies have also bought up lots of smaller breweries. So Anheuser-Busch owns like Goose Island, 10 Barrels, you name it, as well as owning other parts of the distribution. Like they own home brewing distribution. They own distribution companies. They own all these different levels. So with craft beer, like my favorite hashtag when I'm like using Instagram on it, beer historian, by the way, hashtag drink local is kind of one of my favorite ones because knowing that it is produced locally, knowing that it is the money going towards someone who I care about. I mean, if it's bad beer, all games are all everything's off. But I'm glad to support someone who's living their dream and doing that in a local environment. And that leads to some very local flavor too, which is a lot of fun.
Rachel, could I just make one very brief, somewhat humorous comment?
Go for it.
When I was in college, we drank an enormous amount of beer. We could not get enough. And based on resources or lack thereof, most of the time, we were buying Narragansett beer because it was the cheapest, but also because of what those bottle caps were. And it was such a brilliant idea, marketing wise, that, we'd be there well into the night saying, oh, we got to open up another few to see what's under that cap, And I've always been curious why other companies didn't do something like that.
Well, actually, my first beer I ever had was actually a Magic Hat number 9. I grew up in Vermont. I went to school in Western Mass, and I mean, Magic Hat, their caps had the same type of thing. So much fun, and such a weird, kooky company.
Right. What did they have under the caps? I have no idea.
Oh, they just had like short little riddles, or like this was your first but not your last. Just funny little sayings, just something that was just entertaining,
Right.
totally something you wouldn't quite expect.
I didn't know anyone else did that.
Yeah, only one I can think of.
Don't forget
Deschutes,
Snapple for a
actually,
while.
Deschutes, California. No, Deschutes in Oregon also used to do that for a little bit too.
Yeah.
Or Cracker Jacks.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Cheers. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. This is
Thank
great.
you, Malcolm.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel. Great job.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us.
Okay. Good night.
Good night, everybody.